So the second reason that biodiversity, or another reason why biodiversity is important, is that in fact, as we reduce natural biodiversity, we increase the opportunity for pathogens and species that are harmful to us to arise. And this is a plot of emerging infectious diseases from 1940 to 2004. And you'll see that actually most emerging infectious diseases that have been documented occur in the developed world. And many of them are in fact the result of drug resistance, which can be attributed to the use of antibiotics in animal agriculture, which improve the productivity of animal agriculture, but are not really needed in terms of disease resistance. And so what happens is these forms of bacteria that can then infect humans or transfer drug resistance to bacteria that can infect humans are emerging infectious diseases that pose health problems to us. And one example, certainly that's not of a antibiotic resistance, is the development of forms of flu which can recombine as a result of intensive agriculture, combinations of birds being kept in close proximity with swine, where the flu virus actually then can acquire characteristics that allows it to then be introduced into humans. Now, we in the United States don't practice that type of intensive agriculture, but it's widely practiced in Asia, and that's a major concern for the development of new forms of virulent flu. So the summary is that agriculture is one of the largest drivers of genetic erosion, species loss, and conversion of natural habitats. Globally, over 4,000 assessed plant and animal species are threatened by agricultural intensification. Over 1,000 of threatened bird species are impacted by agriculture. Overfishing and eutrophication caused by high nutrient runoff are among some of the largest threats to inland and marine fisheries. And intensive agricultural intensification and erosion of biodiversity selects for species detrimental to mankind and their principal foods. And the question is then, what is fair not only to these other species, but to others that don't have the medicines and capability of withstanding some of these threats to their health? And one other question, coming back to a slide that was shown earlier about food systems, the amount of food that's available to us. Question that I'd like to raise in the discussion is whose diet, between the Revises that live in North Carolina with this diet, or the Abukapars in Darfur, Sudan with this diet, which of these two diets do you think relies to a greater extent upon preservation of biodiversity? And we can discuss that in the discussion. So thank you. Thanks for your help.
There's a couple other slides.
You want me to leave this on?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the purpose of this last slide is to remind you that the coordinators of this program were Donna Murley and Mary Hendrickson. Give you their contact information if you want additional information. Get a hold of the slides if you'd like. What else? Does that cover it? Okay. So thank you to all our panelists and to you for being here. The floor is open for your questions or comments, or questions and comments from the panelists to each other, but we especially look forward to hearing from the audience. Because I don't have to repeat the question. Jill is back there with a microphone. She's going to run around and capture your question for the recording.
Hi. So, within the past few months, past year, there's been discussion about food stamps and possibly placing restrictions on the types of foods that people can purchase with food stamps. And it's normally framed in terms of health concerns, people purchasing sodas and other so-called unhealthy foods, but it's hardly ever framed in terms of a fairness issue and coming at an answer to that question, looking at issues of fairness. And I wonder if any of you all would like to kind of address that question. Is it fair to place restrictions on the types of foods that can be purchased with food stamps?
I'll go ahead and jump in on that one. The way I would answer that question will be to appeal to the principles of fairness that I outlined, and so ask if any change in the particular policy increases the choice that people makes individuals or makes the system more transparent and so forth. And so, if we're ever telling people they cannot eat particular foods, then that, in my view, that is a restriction of choice. And so the question is that we need to ask ourselves, is there a really good reason why we are limiting choice? If it is that we would really like people to eat healthier, what's the best way to do that, regardless of whether we're providing food stamps or just making food available for purchase. And so I will appeal to my particular principles, one of which is transparency and information. Let's provide the information that is needed, and then let people make decisions.
I share that similarly, too. It's a question of who has the power. And because I'm wealthier and I have more power, then I don't have to be restricted in my choices. But we're looking at a population, again, with less economic, less political power, and that's not fair to make their decision-making narrowed because they're in a particular socioeconomic situation. So that's a question of fairness there. And I guess I would lean toward, less restrictions, but, again, make the situation more equitable, so that they could freely access other food that is valued more highly economically.
And as, I don't know if you guys can hear me, but our program is funded through SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is also known as food stamps. So we're the education portion of that. And there are some other issues of barriers and access tied to that, and that one, if you restrict the food, can they even get the food that is being expected to be purchased? And two, if we expect people to buy fresh fruits and vegetables, do they have the means and the ability to even prepare them? So if it's a question of, do I spend $10 on broccoli or $10 on junk food, you have to look at whether or not the food purchase will even be consumed. And there's, I think, an issue that not everyone sees, because you probably know how to steam broccoli, but the participants who walk into my classes definitely don't.
Next question?
Must I stand up?
Sure.
Oh, gosh. This is really, really interesting to me. And I appreciated when Harvey started out by saying that fairness is an expectation. I mean, it's a social construction from people's perspective. And then Larry came in and started talking about equity. And it seems to me that equity and fairness are two different ideas. But he was the only one that sort of talked about this issue of equity. So I guess I'm wondering, with Harvey and Bill and Rachel, if you would go so far as to say that, for instance, exposure to harm or impact on species, that you would use the word equitable, that you would look for equitable exposure to harm, equitable harm on species, or equitable access, and that's the way that you would include equity in terms of fairness, if that would be part of your definitions now. Do you know what I'm saying? Equity is something that we can objectively measure. Fairness is something that's more difficult. And so would you include equity in your definitions, the way Larry does?
Well, there are different ways to think about equity, and I think Larry captured this idea. We can establish equity from an initial position. Does everybody have the same starting position? But we can also look at equity from a perspective of the final outcome. Are people ending up in the same way, regardless of what their starting position is? And there's considerable debate. I think about which of the two should take precedent. And so, I will go back to my principles. Are people able to make choices? Are they informed? Do they have a sense of value? And even if you take the case of value, value is based upon an assessment of what I'm giving up to get something, and equity certainly can be part of that type of a consideration. So I think equity is certainly consistent with the way I'm approaching fairness, but again also recognizing that there are different ways that we can think about equity.
No.
I share that opinion. I think I struggled in thinking about what I wanted to say as to whether or not equity was a more reasonable use of the sense of justice and fairness. I think from what I see, I think that it would be very appropriate.
And I'm in agreement with them in terms of access and some of these issues with barriers to getting the food. I think that equity and fairness are very closely linked together in terms of being able to be accessible to everyone.
David, did you have a question? This has just been fascinating to me. Just a comment and then a question. The FDA has, the USDA has studied in great detail this business of what food stamp recipients eat compared to the rest of us. And the difference is insignificant. And maybe it's because we all eat badly, but there really isn't. There's a myth and they have very good data on their website about that. But my question is, in the family nutrition education programs, you talked about some successes and for what dollar you spend. What areas have you found the most frustration in that you've not been able to accomplish much in terms of long-term benefit?
I'd say one of our biggest challenges is even reaching all of our population and trying to access, since we're funded through SNAP, they look at our percentages of how much of the food stamp recipient we're reaching, and of course we'd like to reach more. And that's part of the biggest challenge, I'd say, in that we try to meet our participants where they are, but we do have issues with access even to the places that they're going. So we have close relationships with WIC agencies as well as some food pantries and that sort of thing, but I'd say that's one of our biggest challenges, is trying to reach a broader spectrum of SNAP recipients, if that makes sense. And of course, we'd like to increase some of our percentages and increase food safety practices and those sorts of things, but I'd say that's our biggest challenge.
I think this is for Dr. Folk. The question that I'd like to ask is, you showed areas where we've reduced our biodiversity. Are there farming methods that will increase biodiversity while managing to feed twice the number of people in 2050?
Very good question. That I think really ought to be a point of considerable effort for our College of Agriculture for our agricultural production systems. Certainly, the direction in which we've moved towards monocultures is not what is going to promote biodiversity, but I think there's considerable belief in that monocultures may not be necessary in order to feed all of the people that we are expecting to have to feed in the world if we properly use diverse farming practices that are less damaging to biodiversity. But that's, I mean, it's a problem that needs to be addressed. I don't have a simple solution to it, but I know that monocultures are not the solution that we ought to be striving for.
It's also what is raised, both plant and animal, in what part of the world, under what conditions. And we so often impose a particular narrow set of species in this environment and then make it work in other environments. And rather than going to one particular ecosystem and saying, hey, what can be produced here in a diversity situation and also have volume. But we get narrowed down and saying, you know, well, corn, so we're going to use corn as many ways as possible. And instead of saying, well, maybe corn produced in this area is fine, but it also can be mixed with other things. But some other part of the world produces something else better. So when you just look at grains, we don't have to narrow it down to 3 grains. There's many more out there that do better in other parts of the world. And again, there are many places in the world that are experimenting in diversity in small plots, which could be diversity in large plots too. I mean, we sort of wake up to the fact that, you know, you don't have to just turn it into coffee. You can do other things there too at the same time. And that's going on all over. Even in Kansas, some of you may know the Land Institute. We're looking at, again, indigenous species of grasses that you don't have to keep cultivating and keep fertilizing and so on and so on. And look at the particular location and ecosystems there and see what abundance can be produced uniquely and with diversity.
Jill, there's a question up in the front. One there too? Okay, good.
Thank you. I found this topic extremely interesting as well, and the gentleman just spoke last. You just covered a lot of what I was thinking about. I guess in my terms, it would be trying to put a square peg in a round hole when it comes to feeding people. And this young lady here was addressing the issue of the areas that she works in where there's a lot of poverty. And just the thing that I wanted to say was I'm encouraged by what you all are doing here today, because I think ignorance is a huge barrier for any group of people. And if you want to feed the world and feed them healthy food and everything is fair when it comes to food, then they have to have the knowledge, not only good foods to eat, but like you said, how to prepare those foods. And that's huge, because there's a lot of people that, like you also stated, that are not being reached. And how do you reach them? You know, forums like this, those people wouldn't come to, and if you don't learn it in school and in programs like Extension, then where do you learn it? And so, thank you for the encouragement.
Let me go ahead and just quickly respond to that. I appreciate that comment. The 4 of us on the panel did not coordinate our remarks. So we did meet and kind of explain kind of what we're going to do, but there was certainly no coordination. However, there was some commonality, and I think one of the common things that each of us mentioned was the importance of literacy and information, and simply being informed. We need to be informed about what is happening, and the kind of and the information that is being conveyed needs to be conveyed truthfully and carefully in a way that people can understand. And I'm a believer of the power of people to change for the better if they know what's going on. And if the better information and the more we can do to make people aware about what's happening, make the choices very clear to them with the consequences of each of the choices. I'm a firm believer that people can make changes for the better, so I appreciate that comment.
This is kind of a case in point, but in a couple of visits to Cuba, who had suffered under an authoritative situation and then had a collapse of the Soviet Union, and they were isolated and trying to produce, and they couldn't just trade sugar for oil, all the situations. Well, the amount of organic urban agriculture that emerged over their special period, they were sort of saying, hey, we got to produce food. And guess what? They found out that they could produce all kinds of food and actually increase the caloric intake because they started saying, we can do it here. Now, that's a microcosm, I know, but it's a situation where they found out, here's the situation, let's get educated and let's produce. Now, that kind of thing can happen when you just, I'll sort of connect that with this morning. I went out to my garden and picked a few things, and here I was watching some green leafy things growing. They're doing just fine. And I thought, so why am I subsidizing out of public funds water systems in Arizona to grow lettuce so they can ship all that water back to Missouri when I could be growing green leafy things right here at this time of the year? And I go, well, that's a question of fairness and appropriateness, but again, it's choice of what we're growing, choice of systems we want to produce, but it's a matter of being educated. That same green leafy thing that's growing out there, who's going to come up again next year, actually, in that same spot. Well, that's just, it's modest, but it's education that improves the situation, both in terms of quantity, diversity, and quality.
I want to thank you all. I guess my question, I was thinking about fairness, and I thought that seems like almost a philosophical question. And most of the time, those don't have easy answers, but we can always take an issue and say, well, this might be fair, this might not. And I started thinking about one of the great Western thinkers of our time, Forrest Gump. And maybe we could say fair is what fair does, and while I'm all for lessening the impact of, things on the other species, the world around us, it's kind of depressing to think that the best thing I could do is to not live, and that would create the least amount of impact. But that's not going to happen. So philosophically, I wonder how these issues can be resolved, or what practical things do you think of when it comes to taking these questions and then create. I mean, I know we have WIC programs and that sort of stuff, but for sort of a more long-term answer, what sort of ideas do you think are going to be important to make practical use that's still fair, I guess? Any ideas on that?
I'll maybe say in the pause that I think I've been thinking about a version of that question. I keep coming back to the slide with the pictures of the people and the fence. I don't remember if that was Larry's slide. And the different notions of equity or equality, equity from starting position, equality of final outcome. And so I guess my own assessment of the situation is we certainly don't have equality of outcome, but it doesn't seem to me personally like we have, when it comes to access to food, for example, even equity from the starting point. And so the practical part in my thought was, okay, so what public policy interventions or other kinds of interventions might have some hope of getting us at least to the equity of starting position way of looking at things?
I was thinking about costs at the end, and particularly when Bill was sharing, how come those costs aren't fed back into the production end of it, so that we have to pay for the consequences of environmental damage or species. And there's folks out there been saying that before us too, but we don't look at the whole cost of a particular food item. So those of us that have the wealth ought to be paying the full costs of what the way we're producing food costs, which would be an equity thing. then the better, healthier, environmentally wise food would be costing what it should if the costs of how we produce get raised. So but that takes public policy and education and willingness of folks to say, well, yeah, I really ought to pay $200 for that hamburger because that's what it costs to the environment, to the health of the system. And not make.
Why does that hamburger cost $200?
Well, to take into account the production and if.
That's right.
Yeah, and the consequences.
So the perspective that I take is, can we do better? Is there anything that we can do better? And I think that's really what you're asking. Is there anything that we can do, to improve the fairness? Three things come to mind that we can probably do better. One is what we're doing here, is talking about and providing information, making people more informed about what is happening in the food system. The second thing is to make sure that rules are applied fairly and equally to all. And the way we can make things better is either subsidize all agricultural commodities or get rid of subsidies. Don't pick. And one of the problems that we have is we are subsidizing those particular commodities that create the environmental impacts that Bill and other scientists are saying. And so if we get rid of the subsidies, that will level the playing field, make things more equitable, and we'll see some changes. And the third thing is, again, relating to this idea of making the rules apply fairly or equally to everybody, is if we're going to give food stamps, take food stamps for instance, let people use food stamps wherever food is available. We're seeing some of that in farmers markets. I think that is a good thing. But if we're going to give people, increase their ability to obtain food by means of a government program, then let them choose where they get the food. Don't pick. You can only buy it here at this particular place, but not this particular place.
Final question?
More comment, please.
Oh, Mary has a question. Is it related to that directly? Or? Okay. You make a comment.
Okay. We're talking about education, and we're talking, all of us are very impressed and taken with everything that's been said here. But, we're here in an educational institution. I'm thinking, should there be more education along the lines of creating documentaries that teach people what she's trying to teach them and hitting her head against a brick wall when we see all the movies about the gangs and the violence and the hunger and the poverty and all of those things. So maybe someone should be talking about creating movies about how to feed people and how to teach people how to make better choices. When you see someone go to the store and they want to buy one lobster and cut it up and feed 8 people, when they could have bought a chicken breast and a head of cabbage and fed those people a lot better. Ignorance is just rampant, and somewhere along the line, someone's got to teach. And this is what this is all about, is teaching. But look how many people are in this room. It's just a small amount of people. So this kind of education has got to be moved into some forms of documentary that a lot of people can see. They're going in to see something and they wind up seeing something else that really taught them something. I'm sure that you've seen people driving really expensive cars. That's because of ignorance. They've made a bad decision, because they don't have food at home to feed the kids and all those things, and they're trying to drive a really expensive car that costs a whole lot of money to maintain. And some of that's ignorance. Some of it's selfishness, but still it stems from ignorance. So just wanted to say that. Thank you.
All right, now the final question.
And there are some documentaries, Soul Food, A Place at the Table. There's a great, I just tried to find out on YouTube, there's a great video made by kids talking about what not to eat in a convenience store and how they're been held back by the system. So there's some really good stuff out there. And Larry sort of asked my question, and I just want to come back to it, particularly in light of Bill's presentation and Harvey's. But I am wondering how, because we trade everything in money, in monetary terms right now. So the question is, when we try to talk about fairness, then how do we incorporate that or think about that in monetary terms, and how do we, or I don't want to say monetize it, but how do we get to a notion of fair in terms of internalizing these costs and thinking about that? How does that actually work? So when I think about fair food, if I want to buy fair food, I want my farmers to be paid well, but what's well? Does that mean what the president of the university makes, or what? And then the workers, what's well? And I would say most workers in the agricultural system are not getting paid well. In fact, they are getting paid unfairly at restaurants, in the fields, whatever. So I guess the question is, how do you actually get this into the practical terms of the monetary issues that are at stake in this, or that could help consumers figure out a way to maybe prioritize these kinds of things in their lives?
Without being a dictator.
I don't think that we can monetize it, and I think we just have to get away from viewing it in that context. And the sense of self-fulfillment, satisfaction, is just what we have to be able to expand. Yeah.
Well, we have the value systems in place that already do tell us that, but it's not monetizing. Well, and that's some of the stuff when I was talking about with religious valuing, when food is considered sacred and when the workers who produce the food are considered sacred. So that's a value shift, but I don't know about monetizing that. But we've gotten away from a lot of the ways in which we did bless the land, bless the food, bless the workers. And so there could be some things we can do in the quality of our life as a society to get those things back in focus. That's not monetary, that's finding new symbols, new icons, new rituals that get back to that. Now, my background growing up in a rural area in southwestern Nebraska, soil conservation was so valuable that was the big annual festival, was the Soil Conservation Jubilee. And now that put us, though, in a frame of mind of protecting the land, of honoring the workers and the producers. And, again, I don't think we do that very much anymore.
Perhaps that's a thought we could bear in mind while we share some refreshments, which are available in the back of the room. Thank you all for coming, and please do fill out those forms and turn them in at the end.